Hello and welcome to The Hindu. I am Maitri Purecha, and today we have with us celebrated author of best-selling books The Fault in Our Stars, Looking for Alaska, The Anthropocene Reviewed, among many others. But his latest book and his second non-fiction work, Everything is Tuberculosis, The History and Persistence of Our Deadliest Infection, is set to be released this month. Thank you, Mr. Green, for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be with you.
And Medicines is Scars, that also includes India. Now, tell us the process of writing this book, imagining the length and breadth of the narrative from personal history to your friendship with Henry in Sierra Leone to taking on the US Congress and the drug companies. Also, tell us a little bit about your tryst with Sierra Leone and what took you to Africa and how much time did you spend with Henry to capture his story. It's interesting how you have told the story of TB, particularly by following the story of one boy and making it about the entire populace of 1.25 million people who die every year from TB.
Yeah, it's hard to know what that means. 1.25 million people dying every year from TB. It's an overwhelming statistic. We don't know how to process those kinds of numbers, I don't think. And so I wanted to write about one person and his personal experience with tuberculosis as a way of humanizing the disease and understanding that the disease lives inside of individual people. I met Henry at a tuberculosis hospital in Sierra Leone in 2019, and I didn't know he was a patient. I thought he was the child of a nurse or someone working in the kitchens or one of the doctors. But eventually the doctors explained to me that he was a patient and that even though he was moving around and talking and looked pretty healthy, the doctors could tell that his tuberculosis wasn't responding well enough to the antibiotics he was on, and therefore eventually his infection would come roaring back. When it did come roaring back, there was very little that they could do for him, and that was their concern at the time. I was in Sierra Leone to learn about maternal health. So my wife and I have long invested in maternal and child health projects to try to cut the rate of maternal mortality globally. But when I came home from that trip, I learned that TB is still our deadliest infectious disease, and I was horrified by that. I was horrified that the deadliest infection in the world is one that we know how to cure.
Right. So, interestingly, of 1.25 million deaths from TB annually, 26% of these are in India, which means 1 in 4 people dying are from India. Now, what similarities can one draw, for instance, between Africa and India when it comes to TB? Because you mentioned stories of Nandita Venkatesan, Shreya Tripathi, people who are very well known, vociferous activists for TB. Shreya, unfortunately, isn't there with us anymore. So, could you elaborate a bit about India as well? Because I found India to be captured in bits and parts in the book, but you focused entirely on Henry's story. So, were there parts that you still wish you wanted to include in the book but couldn't? And what did the research involve?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot that I wanted to include in the book that I ended up not including a lot about TB in India because, in many ways, TB is a crisis in India, as you know, and I talk about the activists who have made it possible for TB response in India to get much better over the last 10 years, like Shreya Tripathi, who sued her government in order to get access to the newest and best antibiotic, bedaquiline. Unfortunately, that came too late for Shreya by the time she won the court case, but by the time she won the court case and got access to bedaquiline, her lungs were just too scarred and too damaged for her to survive. And so she passed away. And she was a big fan of my book, The Fault in Our Stars. I didn't know that until I started learning about Shreya and talking with one of her doctors. But knowing that she was a fan of my books really changed the way that I understand that. It, reminded me that, my books have traveled internationally, and that someone like Shreya would care about my books meant a lot to me because she's one of my heroes. I also tell the story of the young survivors of TB who worked with the Indian court system to establish that bedacoline's patent should not be extended forever, but should instead be limited. And that decision has made it possible for Indian-based manufacturers. I mean, India really is the pharmacy of the world. And that decision has made it possible for Indian-based uh, pharmacies and pharmaceutical manufacturing processes to develop bedaquiline that costs 60% less. And so now we finally have a world where the newest, best drugs are much more affordable to people. Hopefully that will mean fewer deaths from tuberculosis. But unfortunately, with the United States stepping back so much of its funding to fight tuberculosis, there's a real crisis now, and it's not clear who is going to step up. I hope it will be countries like India stepping up into the vacuum that the United States has created.
I totally understand. So, the issue with bedaquiline now being able to be manufactured by generic companies is that, and we as journalists, for one, are trying to see in India is how many companies are coming forward and doing it as a sort of a cost effective measure, and is it cost effective for them as well? Now, that is an investigation that one is still about to get into, and understand how the production of drugs in generic pharma companies, especially bedaquiline, is that decision actually affecting people on the ground, and are the drugs becoming more accessible? Is the gap that we are trying to check and fill.
Yeah.
Um, what do you probably have to say about that? Because, like, what is the next step after the access has been opened up? But what about the people who are going to take it up?
Well, many people who need bedaquiline still aren't getting it, and so cost is not the only barrier. There are other barriers as well, including the complexities of distributing the medication, especially to rural communities, and just updating, getting everyone on the same page that these bedaquiline-based regimens are the future, and we need to be using them now, not just the old injectables regimen for drug-resistant tuberculosis. But I also think, it's discouraging that drug stockouts are common. Drug stockouts are common in India. They're also common in the United States. We just had a stockout of isoniazid, a really critical tuberculosis drug that's been around since the 1950s or 1960s. There's no reason for the United States to have a stockout of isoniazid. There's no reason for India to have stockouts of isoniazid or bedaquiline. This is happening because of the failures of human-built systems. And so we need to work hard to reform those systems to include more people and make sure that we're doing a better job of distributing the drugs, not just developing them.
I understand. And going back to your previous statement on knee jerk reactions of the current political dispensation in the US, President Trump's government are being felt in developing countries, even in India, where the funding of up to the tune of $32 million for controlling HIV alone by USAID. And now that support has been reversed. $32 million were pumped in for the last 5 years, and this particular grant, PEPFAR, was extended for the next 2 years. But the extension came by, and then the government changed, and it is just stop work everywhere across board in India on the ground. HIV, TB, diabetes, all of these conditions share a deep sense of interconnectedness. And how do you see such decisions again impacting the goal of eliminating TB, one that you have vociferously been advocating for?
Well, you're absolutely right that these diseases are all interconnected, right? We know that diabetes, for instance, is a huge risk factor for tuberculosis. So is HIV infection. Tuberculosis is the leading cause of death from HIV/AIDS. And so all of this is interconnected. The whole story of global health is interconnected. Tuberculosis anywhere is a threat to people everywhere. There is no way that you can insulate yourself from an airborne disease. What we have to do instead is fight that airborne disease. And fortunately, with tuberculosis, we have the cure. We have a way to fight the disease in a meaningful way. So my hope is that we will continue to fund tuberculosis response, malaria response, HIV response, response to non-communicable diseases like diabetes and heart disease, cancer, that we will find ways to continue to fund this, because that is what we are here to do. We are here to make a healthier world for each other so that each of us can live a healthy and happy and productive life and not have our lives ended needlessly by these diseases that we know how to address. That's why it's so devastating to me to see the United States government walk back on its long-term commitments to health funding, because this isn't just about this isn't just about health in India or health in Sierra Leone or health in the United States. It's about the whole global story of human health. And in many ways, we've made so much progress. I mean, look at the progress India has made in the last 30 years on child mortality. That's one of the greatest successes in human history. And to see us now regressing, to see us taking steps backwards is absolutely devastating to me.
So TB for you is clearly much more than just a book. It has become rather a mission since the last 5 years, as you mentioned in your epilogue, where you have advocated for End TB Now Act before US Congress and pushed for more funding for anti-TB initiatives in low and middle income countries. So could you tell us a little bit about your tryst with US Congress and what it took to advocate for End TB Now Act? Why should US care about TB in the other parts of the world?
Well, the US should care about TB for the same reason that all rich countries should care about TB, which is that we became rich largely through extractive colonialism that has resulted in a wildly unjust and unfair global social order where some people have access to the newest medications and the newest treatments and other people don't. And that's a failure of a human-built system, in my opinion. We should also care about tuberculosis because there are 10,000 cases of tuberculosis every year in the United States. There is plenty of tuberculosis circulating. We have a tuberculosis outbreak right now in the middle of our country in Kansas. But ultimately, we should care about tuberculosis because we should care about human health. And tuberculosis for me is an example, the prime example of what happens when we don't do a good job of distributing the global resources that we have to address healthcare crises. And so I see this as a product of history. We don't live outside of history. We live inside of history. We are all products of history. And I see the current global TB crisis as a product of the long history of distributing resources unfairly and acting as if some lives matter more than others.
In fact, it's very interesting how your book mentions gaslighting and tuberculosis being apparently a rich man's disease in the 19th century before, and with how fashionable it was to to be inflicted by consumption. So, what were you sort of, can you take us back a little bit to that sense that you gave in the book, because you mentioned the extractive colonialism and its connection to TB?
Yeah, so in the early 19th century in Europe, it was widely believed that only Europeans could get tuberculosis, that only white people could get tuberculosis. And it was seen as a very ennobling disease. It was seen as a disease that made you beautiful, so it gave you very pale skin, red cheeks from the fever, gave you wide eyes. All of these became beauty standards in Europe and the United States. And it was also seen as making you brilliant. It was seen as a disease that made you super intelligent and sensitive and a wonderful poet. Charles Dickens called consumption the disease that wealth never warded off, a disease that anyone could get, no matter how rich you were. In fact, the richest person of the 19th century, Jay Gould, died of tuberculosis in his 40s. And so it was just it was imagined as a very different disease from the way that it's imagined now. Today, tuberculosis is often imagined as a disease of poverty, even though anyone can get tuberculosis. It's often understood, it's a highly stigmatized disease, but in the early 19th century, it was a highly romanticized disease.
And I'm particularly curious to know what made you write this book, what and this particular passion for the book. Where did it come from? In the sense that there has already been a lot of work, in the past about TB. People have intensively and extensively documented the history. They've documented the contemporary nature of affairs. So your book, Everything is Tuberculosis, how do you position it as, and what is the what is it that you want to tell the entire world out of it? For instance, is it because it's popular non-fiction that you think that it will be read more by people, and therefore it is like a highly condensed version of that you try to present, which tries to evoke thought? What is your motive behind writing the book?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that there's a lot of great books about tuberculosis out there. I think about Vidya Krishnan's Phantom Plague, especially, which is a wonderful book and an overarching history of TB that also tells the story of Shreya Tripathi. I wanted to write this book because Henry asked me to, because Henry wanted me to share his story, but also because I want people to pay attention to the tuberculosis crisis and the crisis of diseases of injustice more generally. And I know that I have a megaphone. I know that if I write a condensed, short, accessible book that can be read broadly by lots of people, it's more likely that that book will be read by lots of people because of my name and everything. And so I wanted to write a book precisely because I thought it would help more people pay attention to this crisis and know about the people living with tuberculosis and how we should live in a world without tuberculosis.
And there are particularly two things in the book that struck me. One was your personal tryst with OCD and anxiety, which we have also largely talked about in the past. But the second thing was also your tryst with, I think, a highly resistant strain of an infection which you treated with antibiotics. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I don't think people know much about, you know, almost a lot of people go through these, and they keep taking heavy antibiotics for infections which cease to go away and could probably be fatal. So antimicrobial resistance is just this one more thing that's coming up on the radar of public health, and you mentioned that in the book in connection to TB. So could you elaborate a little bit about it?
Yeah, it's super important that we invest a lot right now in tuberculosis case finding and treatment because of the risk of antimicrobial resistance. We're seeing more and more tuberculosis that is resistant to more and more bacteria, and we need to be developing new tools, new classes of antibiotics, but we also need to do a good job of distributing our current tools and making sure that people are getting the treatment that they need for the amount of time that they need it. My own experience with microbial resistance was an infection behind my left eye, between the tissue of my brain and the tissue of my eye. That became inflamed, something called cellulitis. And I don't know anything about cellulitis. All I knew is that my eye hurt. And then I went to the doctor and everybody panicked because it's pretty close to your brain. It's an infection. It wasn't responding to the first or second line of antibiotics. And so eventually I was hospitalized and I was given antibiotics through an IV line. And I spent about a week in the hospital. And then I was able to go home and take the rest of my medication at home. It was a really scary experience. And being hospitalized for that time gave me a lot of time to sit and think and look at the ceiling and wonder if I was going to die as a result of this infection. But it was also a reminder that, microbial
Right. So,
resistance is a threat to all
just a
of
few
us.
more questions, and then we will wrap this up. So, according to an NYT article, it describes you as somebody who wants to eliminate this entirely curable global scourge. Now, as a young adult writer of influence, perhaps maybe you're on the right track, but you yourself mention in the book that it is very tough to entirely eliminate TB, but the goal is no one should die of the scourge. Now, India has, in connection to that, set an elimination deadline
Yes.
had set rather. I remember in 2017 or 18 sitting in the newsroom listening to announcements about how we are going to eliminate TB by 2025. And I am sitting in the newsroom right now in 2025 trying to think about what's going on at the rate at which we were going at that time, at an annual sort of rate of reduction in infections. We would be happy to control it by 2080. So I think India has like this huge challenge of elimination in front of it, as does every other country, and you yourself, I think, are advocating for elimination. So could we just focus on elimination and try and understand what that means for TB around the world?
It would require a lot of resources to eliminate tuberculosis worldwide, and it would require a lot of resources to eliminate tuberculosis in India. But it's a great investment because every time we end a chain of transmission, we never have to worry about that chain of transmission again because this is a curable disease, right? And so in the United States, 100 years ago, we had as many hospital beds, or almost as many hospital beds, just for tuberculosis patients as we had for all other healthcare conditions combined. That's how much money we were spending on tuberculosis. And now we spend very little money on tuberculosis because we've mostly eliminated it from the United States. That could be, and I believe that will be the case in India, that will be the case in Sierra Leone, that will be the case in other middle-income countries like South Africa or the Philippines or Indonesia, but it won't be the case until we engage in active case finding, which means sending an army of people out to find tuberculosis, not waiting until people are so sick that they come into a clinic or the hospital. And it means getting treatment to every single one of those people, and it means offering preventative care to their close contacts, their family members. And so if we did that, we could eliminate tuberculosis. That would require a lot of resources. It would require a big investment, but we know that it would pay off in a big way as well, because we know that for every dollar we invest in tuberculosis research and response, we get $40 of economic benefit in return.
And can you elaborate a little bit on Dana Hair and the appeals to reduce test prices? Because you mentioned it really briefly in the epilogue, and I myself am wondering what kind of tests were these that Dana Hair gives out, and how did you achieve a reduction in diagnostic test prices there?
Yeah, so Danaher makes this incredible molecular test called Gene Expert, which within 2 hours can tell you whether someone has tuberculosis, but it can also tell you whether they're resistant to one of the first line drugs. And then they have another test that can tell you which antibiotics that person's TB is most likely to respond to. And so between those two tests, that's an absolute game changer for diagnostics and treatment. Instead of having to give people first-line antibiotics and wait for them to fail those antibiotics to see if they have drug-resistant TB, we can know from the beginning, we can get them on appropriate treatment immediately, we can make them less infectious, and we can make it so that fewer people get tuberculosis. Unfortunately, those miraculous tests are also expensive tests, and they have been out of reach, less so in middle-income countries like India, more so in really low-income countries. But they've been out of reach for too many people too often, and as a result, we are still diagnosing a lot of tuberculosis through a microscope the way that we did it in the 1880s. And so, along with a lot of other people, I mean, I certainly wasn't the hero of this story, but along with a lot of other people, I was part of pressuring Danaher to lower the price of its standard TB test cartridge, to produce it at cost instead of trying to make a profit from it, since they make plenty profit from other tests, and also they make plenty of profit from charging rich countries for tests. And eventually Danaher agreed to do that. They cut the price of their test, and there's still a long way to go. I think that Danaher should lower their prices further and should lower prices for more tests, especially in low and middle income countries. But that progress is real and worth celebrating.
Can you give us the price at which it was and it got lowered? And
Yeah, so it was $10 and now it's $7.97.
and this is for the entire test, not just the cartridge.
This is just the cartridge.
Okay, and what does the whole test cost?
Well, the machine costs several $1,000s. So you have to buy a machine in order to use the test. But then you can test for everything, not just TB. You can test for HIV. You can test for lots of different flu, COVID. You can test for lots of diseases.
The entire test, the process of conducting the whole test costs $7.
That's right, $7.97, $8.
And one last question for you is another drug of importance, delaminid, that Otsuka Pharma, which is Japanese based, is a major struggle with sourcing delaminid in India. So we've won the battle with bedaquiline, but delaminid remains more or less as difficult to sort of source. Have you happened to also look into that?
Yes, what I would say about that is I think you're right that we've won the cost battle with bedaquiline. We haven't won the distribution battle. We have not won the cost battle with delaminid, and that is essential to the future of fighting tuberculosis, because fighting drug-resistant tuberculosis, delaminid is a very important drug in fighting drug-resistant tuberculosis, and especially in countries like India, we need far more delaminid available so that we don't have stockouts of that drug, that critically important drug. And cost is a major barrier there, and I think that's something that is definitely on my mind.
And as a parting shot, would you tell us what do you have also, in future on your mind when it comes to fighting TB? What are the concrete progressive steps that you are taking along with other TB activists to fight this? Because this is clearly going to be a long fight for all of us.
This is going to be a long fight, but the first current battle is to get USAID and as much funding as possible back online so that we can have at least some response to tuberculosis coming from the US government. And then also, I'm looking at prices for diagnostics and the drugs that are still too expensive, like Delaminib.
But we need to explore this track further to see if it's actually impacting or not impacting things on the ground for now. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Green, and I look forward to a continued collaboration, exchanging works on TB, and working with you to eliminate the disease. Thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to that as well. Thank you so much.